you're pruning, I'm going to start with shrubs, okay, and work my way up. When you're pruning flowering shrubs, the first thing you want to know is when to prune. And when you're going to prune a flowering shrub is the best time, the very best time, is immediately after it's finished flowering. Okay, that may not necessarily be the most practical time, but it is actually the best time to prune a shrub. Because if you prune a shrub right after it blooms, usually it has a growing period shortly after that, and then it sets new buds, new flower buds for the next flowering season a little while after that. So, for instance, if you're pruning a shrub that blooms in the spring, like in say in May, then you prune it right after it blooms, and it grows from May right to about June or July or August or so, and then around September or end of August, it sets new flower buds for the new year, for the next spring. If you prune that plant in the fall, you're going to be pruning off some of the flower buds. Okay. Plants that bloom in the summer, like after about the middle of June, say, they're best pruned either in the fall or in the spring, early spring. You can prune them right after they finish blooming, which is usually in late summer or early fall, depending on the plant. But there's no growth period after you do that. So if you make a mistake and you prune a big hole into the plant, you're going to have to live with that big hole until next year. Okay? So you're better off to prune those plants in the springtime. And for instance, hydrangeas, I like to leave the dead flower heads on a hydrangea just for the texture, so that you don't have just a sticky shrub in your garden for the winter. And then in the springtime, you prune them back, depending on which kind of plant, which kind of hydrangea. So I'm going to cover hydrangeas as a separate topic in a way. But so for instance, those plants, you prune them in the springtime early, usually before the leaves come out, so you have a good idea what the plant looks like when you're finished pruning it. Don't use the nursery pruning as a guide. As a general rule, it's wrong because they prune for convenience and for size. So, for instance, in the fall, they just prune everything back hard so that they can stack them pot to pot and put them inside the cold frame for the wintertime. So don't prune according to what they're doing. So with flowering shrubs, the general rule is, of course, with all plants, is the first thing you do is you cut out any dead stuff. You prune out anything that's broken. You prune out anything that's damaged. Okay, and then after that, it's suckers and/or water sprouts. Now, suckers are the shoots that come off of a plant, and they usually come off at right angles to the branches. Okay, they don't come off at an angle like all the other branches do. They come off at a right angle, and they grow like crazy. They grow way faster than anything else on the plant. Those are called water sprouts, and you prune those off because they don't have any real value to the plant in a way. They do have leaves and they help with the photosynthesize, but they don't help with the flowering and so on. So they need to come off, and then any dead, broken, and diseased branches and so on. Once you've done all that, and you're looking at the plant and it's still not quite right, or it still needs something else, oftentimes it's a good idea with flowering shrubs is to prune everything back. Everything that's 3 years old or older, you prune it back as close to the ground as you can get it. Now, in some shrubs, that's not practical, because if you do that, you wind up with nothing, right? We cut it off at the bottom and you got nothing down there anymore. So you need to, when you're growing the plant, you need to develop some new shoots to come from the bottom. And once you get some new shoots growing out of the bottom, then you can prune the old material back as the new shoots come on and take over. If you can maintain a flowering shrub, especially 2 years or 3 years old and younger, by removing everything that's 3 years old or older off, then you maintain a young shrub. When you maintain a young shrub, it flowers better and it lives longer. If you allow it to get old and allow the big plant, the big branches to grow in and kind of take over, the plant will get old and then eventually it will die. Okay? So if you want to maintain a shrub for a long time and maintain good flowering, then you need to kind of maintain it at 3 years old or younger. Sometimes you can't do that. So you have to kind of play it by ear a little bit. If you're planning to, if you're sort of developing and trying to get new shoots to grow from the bottom, you need to prune bits off the top, or not off the top, but out of the main body of the plant, in order to encourage growth to come from the bottom. You shouldn't remove any more than 1/3 of the entire top growth at any one time. Why am I doing that? Anyway, you shouldn't remove any more than 1/3 of the top growth at any one time, because that encourages water sprouts and suckers. Oh, suckers. Suckers are the things that grow out of the ground that you don't want. Okay. Usually, you find a lot of them around trees, growing at the base of the tree. You see the little shoots coming out of there, and you shouldn't leave them growing on the tree, because they suck the life out of a tree, and they'll reduce its ability to grow. When you're pruning, no, I'll continue with plants. Hydrangeas are a bit of a pain, because there's 3 different kinds of hydrangeas. There's the smooth hydrangeas, the hydrangea arborescens. Those ones are the Annabelles, the Incredibles, and anything like that. Those plants, those hydrangeas, you tend to cut them back really hard in the springtime. So what I like to do is, I like to play it a little bit safe. And although these things will tend to come from the ground, they send a lot of shoots out of the ground anyway. I like to play it a little bit safe, and I'll prune to the last bud that's showing on the branch in the early spring. And I'll wait for the bud to start to spread, start to open up, and then I'll cut it off just above that bud. The macrophyllas, which are the ones like Endless Summers, the pink ones, the twist and shouts, all those pink and purple and blue and all those fancy schmancy ones. Those plants are tricky because they all bloom on what's called old wood. So in other words, the wood has to be at least 2 years old to send a new shoot out and then to send a flower out. If you prune them back hard, you're going to get new growth every year, which means that you'll never see flowers. Or you might see the odd flower, but you won't see a good flowering show. So for those guys, what could I recommend is in the hydrangeas, I like to leave the plants up through the fall, leave the flower heads on for texture. And then in the springtime, you should deadhead. So you need to cut off all the dead flowers off the top and get rid of them. And what I do is I look for as high up the branch as I can find, the biggest bud that I can find high up on the branch. And I'll cut it just above that. So that usually means you're removing about 8 inches to a foot, maybe less, maybe 6 inches of growth off the end of that branch. And in order to, and then that way you don't cut off any of the old wood, and the plant should bloom well after that. If the plants are starting to get big and a little bit unruly, you can cut them back a little harder. Again, not too hard. Don't cut them all the way to the ground. Always leave some wood behind. Again, these guys here will benefit from removing old growth. The 3 years old, like over 3 years, over 4 year growth. If it starts getting really thick and woody, you might have to sacrifice a year's worth of bloom in order to remove some of that really old growth in order to get some freshness back into the plant. And then there's the paniculatas, which are what I call woody ones. They're the ones that look more like a bush. Okay, so they have a framework up here all the time, and they range in size from about 2 feet up to about 8 feet, depending on the variety that you pick. Again, those ones in the spring, you would deadhead them, and that's about all you really need to do. Again, remembering to take off the broken, the dead, the diseased, so on, crossing branches, all the main things. And then you need to remove just to deadhead them, just to get the flower heads off. If you want to maintain a little bit smaller than their full growth, again, 6 to 8 feet for the bigger ones, 4 to 5 for the medium-sized ones, and there are the little ones that only grow up like somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. But for the bigger ones, you can prune them back a little bit and maintain them at around 5 feet or so if you want to. Trying to maintain a plant that wants to get 6 to 8 feet at under 4 feet, then you've got a battle. You're going to fight that plant the whole time you've got it, and that's no fun. So you need to buy your plants according to the size that they're going to become, or the size at least they're going to be comfortable at. Okay. Pruning tools. your main tool is going to be probably your secateurs. Okay, now I brought the Felcos out. That's because this is kind of like your benchmark plant, but they are expensive. $95 for that one there. That's a Felco 2. The Felco 2 is kind of your basic bypass pruner. Now, bypass pruner is one where the cutting blade goes past what's called the anvil. The anvil is a dull blade, and it goes past it so that it makes a clean cut. Okay, this is an anvil secator, and the anvil secator the anvil is like a plate, and the blade comes down and lands on the plate, so it leaves behind a little tiny bit of a stub. Okay, so it's not, these are good for propagation and that kind of thing, but they're not really great for ornamental pruning. Oh, look at that. We will have a draw afterwards for something. For larger branches, this is a bypass secator. Now you can buy these as an anvil as well, but again, I prefer the bypass because they have the sharp blade passes by the anvil and gives you a clean cut. Okay. These come in various sizes. We have ones over there. They're not much bigger than a secator. I don't quite understand, but they're there. And then we have them up to ones that you can actually adjust the handle quite a ways, and for larger branches or where you have to reach a little deeper. Just remember, you have to be careful with long handled things like that, with like really long handles. You don't want to be cutting really, really, really thick branches, like anything over an inch, because more than likely, if you're strong enough, you're going to bend the handles in, and then they won't be any good for anything anymore. Okay. If you have larger branches, like on a tree, then you would use, just a sec. This is a curved pruning saw. This is the best single-handed pruning type saw, not the best brand, but this is the best type of brand or best type of tool you can get. This has Japanese-style blades on it, which are very, very sharp, and they're meant to cut on the pull stroke. You can see how the handle, the blade is curved, and when it's curved like that, when you pull, it automatically puts pressure down on the branch when you're cutting. And then on the release, you let it go, and you cut back again. And these cut very quickly through heavy wood. Like you can cut through a 5-inch branch with this thing probably within about 2 minutes. So you can cut through very quickly, okay? And then if you're doing shrubs and hedges and stuff like that, these are your hedge shears, of course. And again, they come in various sizes as well. This is kind of your normal, your average size hedge shear, and they're good for that kind of thing. Okay. When you're doing trees are a whole nother thing. Again, the same basic basic items like dead, diseased, broken, crossing over. If two branches are crossing and rubbing on each other, then one of them has to go. So you need to choose the one that's going to do the least amount of damage to the tree and cut it off, okay? Because as those branches get thicker, as the tree grows, the rubbing gets worse, and you're always going to have a raw spot there. So that's like people having like a scab, and you keep picking the scab. And the more you pick it, the more likely you're going to get some sort of infection. And that's what's going to happen to that. You're going to get either some sort of disease, or some ants or some other insects are going to bore into that spot or something like that, and you're going to cause more problems down the road rather than saying, well, it's a beautiful tree, I don't want to cut that branch off. But then that beautiful tree could become a beautiful dead tree more quickly than if you do cut that branch off and allow things to fill in afterwards, okay? Again, suckers and water sprouts, they're a priority as well. Again, don't remove any more than a third of the tree, about 30% of the tree, or 33% of the top crown at any one time. When you're pruning large branches, the idea is if you cut down on a branch and you cut it near the trunk and you just keep cutting, what happens is it breaks. Okay, just before you cut through, it'll break, the branch will come down, and it'll peel the bark all the way down the side of the tree. You don't want that, because now you got a huge other problem on your hand. So what you need to do is the first cut on cutting a big branch that you can't support, is you do an undercut, and you come out about 16 inches or so, 1.5 feet away from the tree trunk, and you do an undercut. Don't cut too deep, because then the branch will drop a little bit and pinch the saw, and then you got to go find a new saw. because you will never get it out. So unless you can push the branch up in order to get it out, you've got a problem. So trying to cut less than a third, all you really need to do is cut in there a little bit and cut through the bark, so that you just have a little bit of the bark cut away at the bottom of the branch, and then you move out about 2 inches and you cut part way through. And what will happen is when you get to about 2/3 or halfway through, the branch will break again and it'll snap, but the break will come back to where you did the cut, and then it'll snap off at that point and leave a stub. The stub has to come off, okay? And when you take the stub off, what you're going to do is you're going to cut through what's called the collar. And you look on the tree and you'll see where the branch, the bark has gotten a little wrinkly looking, okay, right near the trunk. And that's the collar. And that's where you've got some really good active growth going on. And you're going to cut through the collar, not flush with the tree, not flush with the trunk. You're going to cut it at more or less at right angles to the branch. So you're going to have a little piece sticking out the bottom where it comes out and curves out a little bit, and you're going to cut it off, and it's going to come out just a little tiny bit close to the tree trunk. And what that'll do is it'll leave a wound behind, and that wound will heal quickly because you've left behind the collar. Okay? If you cut a flush cut, it will heal, but there's more steps involved. If you go through and you make a big flush cut, you cut it off right even with the trunk of the tree, then you've got you need to do some cosmetic things in order to make that thing heal properly. And at that point, you need to make what would look like an eyeball shaped cut with a sharp knife, and you take the bark away from above the cut and below the cut, and you make this eyeball shaped cut. Because if you just leave the cut alone, what will happen is the tree will do that automatically. The bark will die a little bit above and below the cut, and it'll literally make this eyeball shaped cut. So if you get ahead of it, then you don't have those little pockets of dead bark where, again, insects and diseases can get inside there and bore inside the tree. But then it'll take a lot longer for that tree to heal than if you cut through the collar. If you're making cuts on trees that are larger than 1 inch and the tree is in good health, you don't really need to put anything, tree dressing or anything on the wound if you don't want to. If it makes you feel better, you can put tree wound dressing on there, and we sell some stuff over here. It's like a gel, and it comes in a squeeze bottle. Looks like a little Voltaren bottle, and you take thing. It's got a little brush inside, and you take some, and you smear some on, and then you smear it around with the brush, and you just coat the wound. If it's less than an inch or less, and the tree is in good health, that wound will cover over inside of a year or two at the very most, and so it really isn't necessary to put tree wound dressing on a wound like that. Okay. Evergreens are another thing. Evergreens are harder to deal with in a way. If you're working with most evergreens, you shouldn't have to prune them very much. But for instance, if you're pruning junipers and you're spreading junipers, then spreading junipers, if you look at the frond coming off the main trunk, you'll see, and you come off the tip and you work your way down, you'll see a point where you'll see a new frond growing off the top of that branch, pointing out back the way toward the tip again. And what you do is you need to prune back to that point. If you prune to where there's like a Y, then you're going to get a branch that goes that way and a branch that goes that way, and you're going to have a hole here where you used to have a branch, and you don't want that. You need that where you cut off that bit coming off. You need that to grow a new branch to fill that space in eventually. Once that gets too big, you're probably going to cut it back again. So it's going to be kind of like a back and forth thing. With pines, if you're doing mugo pines, or if you're doing like topiary and you want to make those little bally things and things like that, you're going to do what's called candling. So you'll see the new growth on those. You see those little shoots sticking out of the top of the branch, and those are called candles. And when you candle those, what you do, when they grow to be about the size of my little finger. Everybody's little finger is a little bit different. So say about 3/8 of an inch thick and about 2 inches tall, 3 inches tall, before the needles start to spread. Okay. Once the needles start to spread, candling becomes a bit of an issue because that means it's growing some new woody stuff inside. And when you break the candle off, the woody stuff doesn't break off, and that causes all kinds of messes and stuff. So you need to do it before the needles start to spread, and you need to break off the candle. The amount of candle that you leave behind will determine how much growth is going to happen that year. So if you just break off the tip and you leave behind 1.5 inches, you're going to get 1.5 inches of growth that year. If you leave behind 1/2 inch, you're going to have 1/2 inch of growth that year. You need to leave some behind, because needle evergreens will lose needles that are 3 to 5 years old, depending on the plant, on a 3 to 5 year cycle. So every year they're going to lose the needles that are 3 to 5 years old. And so if you take everything off, eventually all of those old needles are going to fall off, and you're going to wind up with a stick, right? With a fancy looking stick. So you need to leave some of it behind in order to allow for some new growth, so that it can take over and fill in for the stuff that's falling off in the fall. What else is there? I think that's it. Are there any questions? Yep. Alberta, there is no real pruning on an Alberta spruce unless you want to make a spiral. And I don't know how to do that, to tell you. I mean, I can probably do it if I really put my mind to it, because I've done some fancy pruning in my life. But Alberta spruces really require no pruning, just because of the way they grow. Now, having said that, you have to watch out for an Alberta spruce, because they are a plant that has been infected with a virus. So it's actually a white spruce that'll grow 60 feet tall and 35 feet wide, and now it's going to be 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. And it's got those little tiny needles on it and so on. Well, that's because it's been infected with a virus, and the viruses cause the plant to do that. But sometimes the plant will do what's called reversion. It reverts back to the original tree, and you'll see a weird looking branch come out the side of the tree, and it'll look like a regular spruce tree. That needs to come off right at the base, right at where it comes out of the trunk, because eventually that's a stronger part of the plant, because it doesn't have the virus in it, so it doesn't have a cold, so it's stronger, and so it eventually will take over and become the tree. So then you'll wind up with a great big tree instead of a little dwarf. Well, they only grow to, they maybe get to be about 6 feet, or 6 to 8 feet. 8 feet's really big for one of those things. When they get to be 7 or 8 feet tall, they're getting pretty old, and because they only grow about 1/2 inch a year. So usually by the time they get that big, they're getting on their last legs. A lot of people prune the bottom branches off them and make them look like a Whoville tree. And that usually puts a little bit of life back in them, because the old branches are gone, the new branches are growing, and it kind of causes a little bit of a rejuvenation, but they look funny. So no, you really can't. There's candling them nearly impossible, because like I said, they only grow about 1/2 inch a year, so the candle's like a tiny little bud at the top. So the only thing you can do is cut the top off of it. But if you cut the top off of it, you're going to change the shape of the tree quickly, and you could wind up with a whole bunch of different. And then if you wind up with a hole at the top of the tree, that'll take forever to fill in. So I don't recommend doing that. Any other questions? Yep. Hicks yews. Hicks yews are a hedge. See, I knew there was something I forgot. Hedges. Hicks yews are used mostly for hedges because of their shape. They're kind of a. Whoops. Don't do that. Don't do that. They're kind of a columnar shape. I think they're more vase shaped, because they tend to be narrower at the bottom and wider at the top if you just let them grow. But they do make a nice hedge. They can grow up to 12 to 15 feet, so they can get quite large. And so if you want a smaller hedge, you should pick something different. If you're making a hedge, you should prune the hedge so that it's narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. Okay? So that way you have the sunlight will get to the very bottom branches, and you'll get leaves and branches all the way to the ground. Otherwise, if you cut it and so make it look like a V, then those bottom branches will get shaded by the upper branches, and they won't grow properly, and you'll wind up with this thing with a lot of excuse me. I think I just huffed a bug. Oh dear. Anyway, it's protein. Yeah, you'll wind up with a strange looking V-shaped hedge, and they don't look that good. And then if you have a hedge that looks like that, when you get winter heavy snow from the winter, they can bend it down. and cause damage that way. If it's narrow at the top, wider at the bottom, then that will take care of the snow loading and it looks nice. Okay. If you have if you want a lower hedge, say 3 feet and under say down to about 2 feet, you could use dense yew if you want to use a yew, which is nice, or you can use boxwoods or something like that. Is that okay? Well, you prune them whenever they need it. If you've got a hedge, you kind of want to keep it neat. So that's unfortunate with yews. Most evergreens grow through the spring till about July and they quit. Yews don't do that. Yews kind of keep growing until the fall. So especially if you're shearing them, right? So if you're shearing a hedge, you're going to tend to do that about once a month, starting when they start showing some growth in the spring, and then continue through the summer until you're done. Another question? Yeah. Japanese maples and any other maple and birch trees, those are called bleeders. Okay, and they, if you cut them too early before the leaves come out, they bleed sap. And so big trees like big maples and that really doesn't bother them that much, as evidenced by the guys who tap the sugar maple trees for sap for maple syrup. But if you do it to a Japanese maple, they're very thin barked and they're not very big. And if you cause them to bleed, especially 1 year is not going to hurt them much, but if you do it over a number of years, it eventually causes a decline in the tree. So you need to prune a Japanese maple after all the leaves are fully out. Not when they're just coming out, but when they're fully out. So you're talking June that you should prune those guys. Okay? Any other questions? Oh, I see. Sorry. Yep. Climbing roses are usually pruned in the springtime. You can do it in the spring or fall. Oftentimes now, climbing roses nowadays are different from climbing roses when I was a kid. Back in the good old days, you used to take a climbing rose, and every year you'd cut it back to probably about 6 or 8 feet, and you would take it and you would pull it off the trellis. You dig a big trench, and you bury it, and then that way you protect it for the winter, and then in the springtime you bring it back up and you put it back up on the trellis. But nowadays a lot of the climbing roses are pretty winter hardy, so you don't have to do that. But usually in the springtime, you prune it back so that you can see more of the main structure, and cut back some of the length so that they don't get too carried away. Roses, I didn't cover. Yes. Rabbit damage. Yeah, for the roses. Yeah, if they've taken all of the bark off, then that branch will probably die. If they've taken some of the bark off, then you can probably leave it, and it'll grow back over and grow back in again. I forgot roses. Anybody grow roses here? Okay, roses. See, why don't you ask these questions? Roses are tricky. The hybrid tea roses, they're the trickiest. And what you do with those guys is in the fall, you prune them back to maybe about 2 feet. Okay, you don't have to be careful. You just cut them back to 2 feet, because that way the canes don't whip around and cause damage to themselves through the winter in the wind and so. Why? Anyway, in the spring and then of course you hill them up so that you cover up the crown and the bottom buds. In the spring, usually around the end of April. Okay, they say in the books that you have to wait till after May 24th when the possibility of frost is gone. But if you wait that long, then you've got a whole another bag of rocks to carry around. So around the end of April, you unhill them. And there's basically 3 methods of pruning a hybrid tea rose. You can prune it like and if you're not familiar, I would prune it this way, like for the novice or the beginner. Come about 6 to 8 inches above the ground, okay, and prune to an outside bud. So in other words, a bud that's facing toward the outside of the tree, the bush. If you prune to an inside, then it's going to grow inwards, and then you're going to wind up with crossing branches, and they're going to be rubbing against each other, and then you're going to have another problem. So this way you get a more open shrub, Man, talk about competition. Anyway, yeah, so you get a more open shrub that way. That's for the beginner. If you're more confident about your pruning and you want to roll the dice a little bit, you can go down a little deeper. You can go down around 4 inches, okay, and do the same thing. Cut to an outside bud. If you're like me, and you don't care if you're, no, I shouldn't say that. You're going to cut back. The deeper you cut, the more the rose will rejuvenate, and the better it is for the rose, but you run the risk of killing it, okay? So you have to stay above the bud graft, and you come down, and so just above the bud graft, and as deep as you can go, you cut off to an outside-facing bud. So that means you're going to have a little plant about this big. Can you hear me if I speak real loud? Yeah? Okay. If you are pruning to the first two methods, where you're leaving some stuff behind, make sure that anything dead, you prune it off completely. Okay, so anything that's holding no buds, prune it off completely, because then you don't have all those branches all around the bottom causing problems. Okay, because again, that's going to be it's going to be a nuisance for one thing, because they're in the way. They catch everything, anything that's blowing in the wind. Leaves, squirrels, diapers, garbage, anything. They get caught in those things at the bottom, and then you got to try to get it off the thorns, and that's just really hard. And the squirrels scream a lot when they do that. So you want to kind of avoid that. So, and then as you're pruning, if you find some dead stuff at the bottom, cut it off as close to the bottom as you can, because that will reduce that problem with the dead branches.